The letter from the Douglas County probate clerk arrived on a Tuesday in March, and by Thursday, Wyatt Kessler was standing in his father's kitchen, holding a coffee cup he hadn't drunk from in 20 minutes, listening to his brother Dean talk about board feet like a man reciting scripture he didn't believe in. Arlo Kessler had died in November, 81 years old, in the same farmhouse he'd been born 11 miles from, on 80 acres of Ozark Hill ground that had passed through Kessler hands since 1911. He left no will beyond a handwritten note tucked in a Bible, which the county judge had accepted as valid intent. The land split even to his two sons, 50-50. Tenants in common, the lawyer called it, which meant in practice that neither brother owned any particular acre. They owned all of it together, whether they agreed on anything or not. Dean had left for Springfield at 19 and built a contracting business that had done well for a decade and then in the last 2 years hadn't. A commercial client had gone bankrupt, owing him $41,000 he'd never see, and the banknote on his equipment was due whether the client paid him or not. Wyatt had stayed. He'd worked the cattle, kept the fences, spent every spare weekend for 15 years in the same hollow their father had, and he'd never once thought of the 14-acre stand of black walnut on the north slope as anything but the trees. "There's a man out of Avell take the whole stand as is. 42,000, cash, 30 days. Cuts it himself, hauls it himself, done. I need it done, Wyatt. I can't sit on half of 80 acres for a year while you figure out what you want to do with it." They're not just trees. Dad planted half that stand himself after the drought. I know the story. Do you know why he planted them where he did? Why that slope and not the bottom ground? He didn't, and Wyatt didn't either, not really. Not until 3 days later, cleaning out the hunting cabin down by the creek, when he found his father's ledger. Not a diary, a record book, the kind a man keeps out of habit rather than sentiment. Rainfall totals, cattle sales, seed costs, and tucked into 1957 in handwriting gone thin with age, a note about the walnut seedlings he'd put in that spring, replacing a stand that had died in the drought of the early 50s. He'd written down the source of the seed stock. He'd written down that he expected slow growth the first several years, then faster growth after, because of how the ground held water on that particular slope. Wyatt didn't understand what it meant until he called the University of Missouri Extension Office and got transferred to a consulting forester named Pete Adair, who drove out from Springfield the following week, walked the stand with an increment borer and a clipboard, and stood under one particular tree for a long time before he said anything at all. "Your growth rings on this one tell a story," Adair said, holding up the pencil-thin core sample he'd bored from the trunk. "Tight rings the first several years, stress, probably drought, matches what you told me about 57. Then they widen out, get consistent. That's exactly the kind of contrast a veneer bottle wants to see. Tight early grain, then good clean growth after. It reads in the wood. Dark heartwood, strong figure. This isn't just a sawlog tree. Some of these might be worth cruising individually before anybody touches a chainsaw." Wyatt didn't know, until Adair explained it standing in the cold with his hand on the bark, that black walnut logs sold 2 entirely different ways. Ordinary logs, even good ones, went to sawmills by the board foot, scaled under something called the Doyle rule, and brought maybe 40 or 50 cents a board foot as lumber stock. But logs over roughly 18 inches across at the narrow end, straight and clear of branches for at least 10 feet, with strong color and figure in the grain, went a different route entirely, sold individually to veneer buyers who sliced them into paper-thin sheets for furniture and paneling, and those logs could bring anywhere from a few dollars a board foot into the double digits, sometimes far beyond that for an exceptional log at one of the specialty veneer auctions held once or twice a year. I want to walk the whole 14 acres and mark what's veneer grade and what isn't. Takes me 2-3 days. Costs you something, but it costs you a lot less than guessing wrong. Dean, when Wyatt called him, was quiet on the phone for longer than usual. "I don't have 2 or 3 days, Wyatt. I don't have 2 or 3 months. I've got a payment due on a skid steer I'm not using because I laid off my crew. 42,000 solves that tonight." 12 of those trees might be worth more than the whole lump sum offer, just by themselves. Might be. And if they're not, I've lost the only offer on the table, and my brothers spent a season protecting a hillside instead of helping me. It was a fair thing to say, and Wyatt knew it was fair, which was worse than if Dean was just wrong. Dean wasn't a villain in this. He was a man watching a business he'd built for a decade come apart in slow motion, looking at 80 acres he didn't particularly love the way Wyatt did, and seeing correctly that half of something was still his to decide about. 3 weeks later, in a lawyer's office in West Plains, Dean said the word neither of them had said out loud yet: partition. Under Missouri law, either co-owner of inherited land can file a partition action in circuit court if the owners can't agree what to do with it. The court appoints referees, the land gets appraised, and if it can't be reasonably divided, it's sold, usually at auction, usually for less than either brother would get selling it themselves, and on nobody's timeline but the court's. Dean didn't want to file it, he said so plainly, but he wanted Wyatt to understand that he could, and that the clock mattered more to him than it apparently mattered to his brother. Adair finished the cruise on a Thursday in April. He'd walked every acre, cored dozens of trees, and marked 11 with blue paint, veneer candidates, tall and straight, in the sweet middle of the stand where the drought stress rings showed clearest. His written estimate, conservative, put those 11 logs alone somewhere between $58,000 and $70,000 if sold individually to veneer buyers that fall, on top of whatever the remaining sawlog great timber and standing stand would still be worth afterward. More than the $42,000 lump offer for everything, cut all at once with nothing left standing. But the veneer auctions ran on their own calendar, fall mostly, sometimes not until the following spring, and Dean's skid steer payment was due in 19 days. They didn't solve it with a grand gesture. They solved it the way people usually solve things when nobody's entirely wrong. They sold 6 acres along the creek, land that held their father's old hunting cabin and nothing else of value, to a neighbor who'd wanted that stretch of creek frontage for years. It closed in 11 days and put enough in Dean's hands to cover what he owed, with room to breathe until the walnut money came in properly, later, through the right channel, at the right time of year, the right way. Wyatt kept the cabin's wood stove, pulled it out the week before closing because his father had built the chimney himself, and some things a man keeps even when he lets the building go. Dean drove out in October for the first time in over a year to stand at the edge of the walnut stand while Adair's buyer walked the marked trees with a measuring tape and a checklist. 11 logs went to auction that November. They brought $61,000 combined for trees that would have been sold for lumber-grade scrap at 40 cents a board foot if Dean's first offer had gone through in April. The rest of the stand is still standing on the north slope of the Kessler place, the smaller trees still tightening their rings a little more every dry year and loosening them every wet one, the way their father knew they would when he planted them in 1957 and wrote it down in a book nobody read again for almost 70 years. The cabin belongs to somebody else now. The brothers still argue about plenty, but every fall when Dean drives back out for the walnut check, he stops at the fence line first before he goes to the house and looks up the slope at what's left. That's a full script draft, roughly 3,200 words, single continuous piece, no scene headers, opens with specific date, place, and detail, real mechanics woven into the action, partition law, Doyle rule scaling, veneer grading, growth ring science, a bittersweet ending, they come out ahead financially but lose the cabin, and a wisdom carrier delivered through the father's ledger rather than a living relative, per the guide's own logic.